people of medieval Europe called it the Great Pestilence. A terrifying and bewildering sickness from the east which brought delirium and an agonizing death. Fear and hysteria gripped the land, and as the death toll mounted, it became apparent that no one was safe and no one could offer protection. As the sickness raced across Europe, communities struggled simply to bury their dead. And they sought answers, someone to blame, or a means to appease God's wrath. This was the Black Death, the greatest biological disaster in the history of mankind. To those engulfed by the madness and death, it seemed the end of the world.
The infectious agent of the plague is Yersinia pestis. It is a bacteria that is primarily spread through airborne transmission. The Black Death originated in China in 1334 and spread through trade routes into Europe. It killed 1/3 of the total population. There are 3 types of the plague. The bubonic plague symptoms are fever, headache, chills, and swollen lymph nodes. The disease is usually contracted from a flea bite. If not treated properly, the disease can spread to the rest of the body.
The plague bacteria invade the lymph nodes, causing them to swell. These are called buboes. If the bacteria get into the bloodstream, they clog the arteries, often ending in death.
The second type of plague is septicemic plague. It is similar to the bubonic plague except for abdominal pain and blackening of the skin or other tissue. The third type of plague is pneumonic plague. It is contracted by inhaling infectious droplets of water, or can be caused by bubonic or septicemic plague. The death rate during the pre-antibiotic era was 66%. Most cases occur between spring and fall, and there are about 1,500 cases of the plague reported each year. Diagnosis requires evaluation by a health worker, along with a blood test. Diagnosis can occur after 2 hours of testing, but lab confirmation is made in 24 to 48 hours. The incubation period is 2 to 6 days. If exposed through the air, infection can take only 1 day. When bubonic plague is left untreated, the bacteria invades the bloodstream and multiplies, called septicemic plague.
The Church and its impact before the plague. In the 1300s, Europe entered a period of mayhem that paved the way for aspects of the modern world as a nation, capitalism, and the Protestant Reformation. This was the period before Europe saw recurring famines, outbreaks of plague, peasant and worker revolts, challenge to the Church's authority, and a sense of betrayal and therefore loss of faith in the Church. Prior to all of the misfortunes, the Church was a main contribution to religious ritual in many people of Europe during this time. It was that which was stable and present in everyday life through prayers and services. During this time, a lot of faith was put into the Church. Therefore, it was rarely questioned or had authority challenged. Death was embraced as a sister and a friend, which was referred to be a welcome bridge to eternal rest. The priest would administer a sacrament of extreme unction, which would help prepare the traveler for their journey. Usually priests and nuns entered homes of the sick in faith. Elaborate funeral processions were held following deaths of a loved one, where they saw their loved ones buried. There was an abundant amount of clergy members and gravediggers involved at funerals. Physicians were well paid and highly respected scholars. Medical tools included books that were still being written in Latin and technology that was labor-intensive. Medical and religious practices were shifted towards the clergy. The original ways of life surrounding the Church included plenty of clergy members. It was easy to recruit people to become members of the Church. There were lower wages in the Church. The levels of faith were high. Authority was rarely challenged or questioned by its members. The environment in the Church was stress-free because it was a place of peace and tranquility for its members. It provided hope, faith, and happiness where people were forgiven for their sins and received salvation.
How the Church changed after the Black Death. The clergy seemed more interested in financial gain and neglected spiritual help. Christians did not abandon their spiritual beliefs, but sought new means of spiritual peace and serenity other than the Church. In the eyes of many church members, the clergy failed. They did not provide adequate spiritual comfort. They fled from the sick while they were calling for help. This left no one to offer the last rites or comfort the sick. The Christian core values did not change, however the selfless image of the church did. Clergy members were later seen as greedy and self-centered, and the threat of imminent death led to a greater need for salvation and peace which they could not find through the clergy. This brought Christians closer than ever. Black Death showed issues with the clergy, not with religion itself. People began to wonder more about imminent judgment day and death. Other means of salvation became popular since the clergy were not around, and there was also more emphasis put on indulgences and good deeds. Churchgoers were advised to go to bed every night like it was their last night to live, stressing the frailty of life. With so many people dying, gravediggers could not keep up and began mass burials with no funeral processions. Few people would go to the burials in fear of becoming infected by the plague in such a horrific sight. The Catholic funeral was held very high in its practices before the Black Death. After this plague, however, it was all changed. Because of mass burials, select men were appointed to be pallbearers, whom were usually already infected or did not mind being subjected to the spread. During these burials, corpses could not enter a church unless they needed to in order to enter the cemetery. The dead were piled up onto a wheelbarrow and hauled to the closest mass burial. Funeral gatherings were limited to prevent the spread of the plague. During the Black Death, the church began to appoint a new group of saints to give hope to the sick. A new saint, Saint Roche, patron saint of dogs, was involved in curing those infected. Paintings represent the confidence sought by believers to receive supernatural aid in overcoming the ravages of the plague.
Long-term effects. A few years after the Black Death, many church leaders renounced their core beliefs, which rooted from the doubts caused by the plague. These leaders included Martin Luther in Germany, Zwingli in Switzerland, Henry V in England, and John Calvin in France and Switzerland. Even though the Black Death occurred a little bit before these leaders were born and the Reformation began, these leaders would have never had a leg to stand on without the doubts the Black Death put in the church. In the Catholic Church, there was extremely extravagant altars and crucifixions positioned in direct relation with the altar. God's presence was only in the church, or at least he had much more presence in the church than in one's home or workplace. The church was absolute and solely protected by God. It was basically seen as God's home. For Protestants, the churches did not have to be as extravagant because God's presence can be anywhere. God's presence is just as great in one's home as it is in the church. This means that there was no altars, maybe just small tables and a cross. Churches today can be seen in school auditoriums or cafeterias, or even in one's home. That could never have happened before the Black Death. This picture is an example of what many churches looked like during and before the Black Death. This is what many Protestant churches look like today, which reflect the values and standards of what many Protestant leaders believed at the time. Protestants do not follow saints or sacraments, which means the Pope and bishops did not have absolute power. They rely on the individual spirit life centered on scripture and preaching. Your faith became your own. Good works no longer had as much value and were not what sent a person to heaven or hell. One does good things because they love God, but not to win favor from the priest or God. Predestination came about, which means God knows everyone's salvation and exactly what will happen in one's life before they are born. Many people do not take their medication or find value in Mass, because God had already decided what will happen to them. Because sacred places were becoming scarce for burial, many people were buried in mass graves or not on holy ground. This has a lot to do with Catholics' belief in purgatory, which is a place people go after death for purification before entering heaven. Protestants began to not believe in purgatory and generally did not pray for the dead because it was too late for them. Today, even though it is important for many to be buried on a sacred place, the majority do not believe that where they are buried influences their destination after death. Jews were pointed at and blamed by many for the Black Death. Many were tortured and held captive until they confessed to doing things they did not do. Many places killed Jewish people before the plague hit them in hopes for sparing their area. This caused many Jewish people to flee to Poland and Ukraine. These two countries were two of the many where Jews were sent to concentration camps in World War II. 1.5 million Polish people died due to the Holocaust. The distrust of many people of the Jewish faith during the Black Death has said to be possibly one of the first causes of the Holocaust.